For our last seminar today, delighted to have Jay McClelland joining us. Jay started his training with his PhD at University of Pennsylvania, then started his faculty career at University of California, San Diego, moved then to Carnegie Mellon, where he was one of the founders and co-directors of the Center for Neural Basis of Cognition, kind of a pioneering partnership between two different universities I know many people here are very familiar with. Now is at Stanford, based primarily in the Department of Psychology, where he's a Lucy Stern professor in social sciences. Jay, a luminary in the field, one of the kind of early pioneers of connectionist models explaining cognitive phenomena with neural networks. Really pushed, along with his colleagues, the development of that area, and you can draw a straight line between that work and the resurgence of neural network models and the excitement of them in machine learning today. Certainly recognized broadly for the contributions of his work. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. I looked this morning. The work has been cited almost 100,000 times in the literature. A list of awards as long as my arm. The one that I decided to pick out to highlight this morning was the David Rumelhart Prize for his contributions of the theoretical basis of cognitive science. So very pleased to have Jay here. I think it hits an especially important intersection given the role of neuroscience and computing and machine learning here on a technology-driven campus like Georgia Tech. So very pleased to have Jay here. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. So I've been trying to integrate mind, brain, and computation for a long time, I guess. And I definitely want to acknowledge the importance of the contributions of people like Dave Rumelhart and Jeff Hinton, but also experimental psychologists whose work was very influential in getting me going, neuroscientists like Bruce McNaughton, who I've collaborated with, and now a theoretical physicist named Surya Ganguli, who does amazingly insightful mathematical analyses of actual neural circuits and artificial ones as well, and his contributions will be featuring in this talk today. I want to start with some very, very basic premises that I work with, and this is my, I guess, most fundamental premise. Your knowledge is in your connections. So for me, an experience produces a pattern of activation over neurons in one or more brain regions. The active pattern that we have as we look out at the world, or as we're reading a sentence and understanding what it means, or in any other situation, is a state, a pattern of activity, but what allows us to have those states and for us to imagine and move from one state to the other is the knowledge that's in our connections. They allow sensory information to produce representations of an understanding of, let's say, a chest position or something like that, or an anticipation of what might happen next. And all that is learned, acquired knowledge that's in your connections. So this lecture is largely about memory, and so we need to have an initial sort of agreement about what we think a memory is. And for me, it's the trace that's left in our nervous system after an experience is just a set of adjustments that were made to connections when we had the experience or as a result of the experience. And so, I think of each such experience as leaving a trace, but, this little neural network here could have many, many different experiences, and each of those experiences is going to result in adjustments of essentially all of these connection weights. And so there's no sort of separate repository of each individual experience. They're all superimposed in the connection weights. The memory traces are not separable or distinct. So if that's true, recall isn't a matter of pulling something out of a store like a book in a library as people used to think about it, right? Recall is a matter of having a pattern evoke another pattern or produce a pattern completion effect. So we can think here, maybe half of these neurons are coming from the fusiform face area, and half of them are coming from a phonological area in the brain. And this set of neurons is representing our visual impression of their face, and this is representing our visual impression of their name. And What happens when we retrieve their name from their face is that somehow or other we use the connections that have been established between these neurons onto these neurons when we experience this association between the name and the face. And now we're going to use them again to reconstruct that pattern that corresponds to that person's name. So a key thing about this is that this reinstatement, again, it depends on the knowledge that's in the connection weights. And in general, this knowledge is going to reflect the influences of many different experiences. You know, this is sort of like, for me, there's like no such thing as the possibility of a veridical memory. It's always the result of a construction involving the utilization of the many past experiences that have adjusted the states of our connections prior to this new experience that then makes further adjustments on top of those. And then when we have an attempt to recall or retrieve, all the knowledge that's in the connections, including the stuff that came from this specific association, is going to play a role in this process. And so we would never think of memory as a veridical process. It's always a constructive act. Okay? So this is a fundamental starting place. Your knowledge is in your connections. That's a key starting point. But there's a second very important starting point for this particular talk, which is that our brains have evolved to have two quite different learning systems, both of which, according to me, are using connections, right? But with slightly different, or maybe very different parameterizations. And we learned something about this from the famous neuropsychological patient HM and from other studies of the effects of brain lesions on memory and learning. So this slide is actually includes a figure that was published very early on, right after HM's lesion. So HM was a neuropsychological patient who had this intractable form of epilepsy, and prior surgeries by Scoville, a surgeon in Montreal, had excised one of these medial temporal lobes from patients, and that had had an effect on their epilepsy without much effect on their memory. HM's epilepsy was so intractable, they said, well, we better take out both this time. So in HM's case, they took out both sides. It did relieve his epilepsy, but it produced this profound memory impairment. But it's interesting what was left and what was not. Okay, so HM exhibited intact performance on tests of intelligence, general knowledge, his language, and other acquired skills. He could tell you the meanings of words. He could read irregular words aloud just as well as anybody could. He had knowledge of the history of the world and of his own early life, and in general could carry on a reasonably intelligent conversation with you. The only thing was, he couldn't remember that he'd done so. So if you walked out of the room and came back 3 minutes later, he'd look at you like he'd never seen you before, and he would start telling you the same stories again. So he had a lot of knowledge, right? A lot of the knowledge in his connections was still there, but his ability to form new memories was like very, very profoundly impaired. He couldn't explicitly remember previous episodes or events. He couldn't learn to associate one arbitrary word with another. Somebody tried to teach him a list of 5 arbitrary word pairs. Take this item, let's say locomotive, and remember the word dish towel with it. Couldn't even learn 5 pairs after 100 repetitions of this. He couldn't even remember that he'd done it from one day to the next. New factual information did not stick. He didn't remember new facts that you would tell him. But you could present an item and later you could present a degraded version of that item and he would recognize it more readily than he would have if you hadn't presented it before. You could use, let's say, line drawings, okay, of like various kinds of objects. He sees the line drawing, and then you present fragments of the line drawing that he's seen before. He can recognize it better than if he'd never seen another set of pictures that you didn't show him before. Okay, so something's happening in his brain. Is somehow being tweaked to leave some residue of that prior experience, but he can't tell us about it, except that he can recognize the picture more readily with fewer segments. Also, he was able to learn new skills, such as being able to draw while looking at his hand in a mirror instead of looking directly at his own hand while he was drawing. This is a hard skill to acquire. We learn it gradually over repeated practice. We tend to want to go the wrong way when we're seeing our hand move in a certain direction, or we want to make a line segment in a certain direction, but we gradually get better at it. He got better at it at a normal rate. He just didn't know he'd ever done it. And other tasks like that. So some kind of learning is spared, but other kind of learning is not, and lots of knowledge is spared. Also, he showed a retrograde amnesia, that is to say, he lost his memory for events that occurred within a period of time prior to the lesion. So, how do we think about this? Together with Bruce McNaughton and Randy O'Reilly originally back in 1995, we formulated the complementary learning systems theory. Sorry, I was told I should point over here. We recently reprised this in a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. But the key ideas are very simple. So the starting place is the idea that connections within and among neocortical areas, which I've shown here in green, support gradual acquisition of structured knowledge through, I like to use the phrase interleaved learning. That basically what that means is that as we go through our daily life, we repeatedly encounter many different things. So, you know, each morning we may have a bowl of cereal, and at lunch we may have a sandwich, and dinner we may have, prepared meat with a couple of vegetables. And, this happens again the next day. So we learn about breakfast, lunch, and dinner in an interleaved fashion, gradually over extended time. And we talk about different subjects at different times of day when we go from one class to another. And we gradually build up our knowledge through this sort of interleaved exposure to all these different aspects of experience. And our neocortical neural networks gradually learn this stuff through a very slow learning process that takes place over what I like to call developmental time. And by the time we get to, middle childhood, a lot of that has already occurred, but it continues as we continue through school and on into our adulthood. These connections are still gradually changing as we have continued exposure to a multitude of different kinds of experiences. Okay? But if we're going to learn something new, we meet a new person who we've never seen before, and somebody tells us that person's name in some situation. There's the situation that's represented in part of our brain. There's the person's face that's represented in part of their brain. There's the sound of the person's name that's represented in part of our brain. And in order for us to we would make little tiny adjustments to the strengths of these cortical connections based on this one exposure. And according to me, we might even gradually learn to recognize this person over repeated exposures. But the cortical system learns slowly. And so if we want to show any sensitivity to this after a single trial, we need to use this rapid learning system based in the medial temporal lobe. This is the part of the brain that was removed in HM, to essentially take the various elements of this cortical experience, which are projected into it, rapidly bind them together by making big adjustments to connections. And then when the person's face is represented to us, it kind of provides a probe back into this medial temporal lobe system, and a pattern completion process occurs, kind of like I was describing before, to bring back to mind the rest of the episode in which you saw this person and perhaps also help you retrieve their name. Now, obviously, this system isn't a perfect one-shot learning system. We often need more than one exposure to learn some new thing. But, you know, with a few exposures to a new person or talking to somebody for a half an hour, we begin to get to know who they are, certainly would recognize that we'd met them before and begin to know something about their name. And that depends on this system. If it's still there later when you see this person again, you'll be able to do this pattern completion process and bring this back to mind. If it's been removed, of course, and you just recently learned it, it'll be gone, right? That counts for that retrograde amnesia part. A key idea is that while this knowledge is in the medial temporal lobe, in the connections in the medial temporal lobe, we occasionally get the chance to replay it, to reactivate it, play it back to the cortical system so the cortical system gets additional learning trials. Now, from my point of view, we want to think about those kinds of replay events as potentially occurring during things like sleep. And there's good neuroscientific evidence now that there are replay events during sleep. Bruce McNaughton's lab has been central in evidence for that. But also they occur when the information is needed again. We see that face again. The hippocampus helps us bring that back to mind. It provides a training trial for the cortical network. The cortical network gets the retrieved result. You don't need the person to say their name to you again because your hippocampus gave it to you, but then you have a new learning experience in the cortex. And so gradually, the cortex can build up this knowledge over repeated opportunities to reinstate these patterns in the cortex where the changes also occur. Okay? So this is the complementary learning systems theory. It's based on this connectionist approach, but takes the idea that there are these two complementary learning systems. Now, so the key points here are we learn about the general patterns of experiences, not specific things. Gradual learning in the cortex builds implicit semantic and procedural knowledge that forms much of the basis of our cognitive abilities. The hippocampal system complements the cortex by allowing us to learn specific things without interference with existing structured knowledge in the cortex. And in general, these systems must be thought of as working together rather than being alternative sources of information. I think, again, going back to that idea from the very first slide, when we're retrieving some person's name, you know, if they're from a culture which uses phonological patterns that we're very unfamiliar with, that's actually going to be harder than if they're from a culture where we're familiar with those phonological patterns, because the cortical networks sort of have the structure into which just a little bit of hippocampal learning can sort of tweak things to make this particular pattern of this particular Pakistani last name work out. But if you have no experience whatsoever with those kinds of cultural patterns, phonological patterns of that language culture, you won't be able to, the same amount of hippocampal learning won't be enough, right? So the general notion is these systems are always working together. Okay. So in the next few minutes, I want to give you a kind of an intuitive characterization of some of the work that I did over an extended period of time, sort of built around these ideas. And then I just want to say that after this more intuitive part, there's going to be a part where I'm going to try to introduce you to a more quantitative theory about some of the same phenomena that we're going to go through this more intuitive presentation. It's a lot to get through in the amount of time available. This is why I may be rushing a little bit up here. But I hope to give you at least a flavor for both aspects of this work. And so here goes. So the next three minutes, I'm going to be talking about how this sort of cortical knowledge gets gradually built up over developmental time. And the key point here is that distributed representations, what machine learning calls embeddings, that capture aspects of meaning, emerge through a gradual learning process. I guess the ability to form these distributed representations is what I ought to say. But we're going to look at the representations themselves as they evolve through this connection-based learning process. And I actually wrote a whole book on this subject with a former PhD student, Tim Rogers. The progression of learning and the representations formed captured many aspects of cognitive development over the first 10 or 12 years of life. That was basically the focus of our book. I only have time to touch on one basic aspect of this, which is the progressive differentiation of conceptual knowledge that occurs over middle childhood. So let me just touch on that as a psychological phenomenon briefly with you. This is part of the inspiration for this whole theory, actually. This is data that a psychologist named Frank Kyle, a developmental psychologist, collected as part of his dissertation research. He was interested in what children thought was okay or silly to say about things. So is it okay or silly to say that a man is an hour long? Well, most kids thought it was silly. So basically, but if you said, is it okay or silly to say a man is awake? Oh yeah, that's fine. You could be awake. You could be not awake. That's something a man could be, so there's nothing silly about that, right? So if the kid said it was okay, then the predicate would end up above the noun in these trees. And if the kid said, no, it's not okay, then they'd be separated. And in this way, he was able to construct what he called predicability trees. And basically, what you can see here is that as kids get older, these are represented individuals rather than averages, but they are fairly representative. The trees become more differentiated. So in particular, younger kids tend to lump all sort of psychological and physiological predicates together, but later on, we tend to differentiate some of the psychological and physiological predicates, reserving some of them only for humans and not for non-human animals. So there's a progressive differentiation process. So I was thinking about Frank Kyle's work, and I heard Rumelhart come and give a talk at Carnegie Mellon shortly after I'd moved there about this very simple neural network model in which the knowledge is in your connections that was offered as a counter to what was then the prevailing view that we extort our semantic knowledge as essentially explicit propositions in a hierarchically structured tree like this one. Okay, so this was the prior idea. Our knowledge of living things would consist of a set of concept units, each of which would have linked to it various relations, and at the other end of the relation would be a completion like a pine is green, a tree has bark, a bird can fly, a canary can sing. And then there are these is-a links, which allow inference. If you don't know something at this level, you can say, well, a pine is a tree, and a tree has bark, so a pine must have bark. Okay, so this was the prior theory, and Rumelhart said, let's build a neural network that uses connection knowledge to store this kind of information. So Rumelhart's network consists of input units, one for each of several different concepts, and other units, which you could think of as capturing the relations in that tree. He was specifically interested in a connectionist rendering of the knowledge in that particular tree. And on the output side, we have units that correspond to the completions of propositions involving the item and the relation, or the item and the context, if you like. So in this case, for example, a robin can grow, move, and fly. And so the neural network is trained with inputs like this, robin can, and that it's taught that the correct answer to this is the correct set of possible completions is grow, move, and fly. So that's a training example for Dave Rumelhart. The training examples were all the things that are true of these items, integrating across the levels of the tree. And there are just a total of 32 training examples, one for each item times context. And he trained this thing with interleaved learning. So if you look at the patterns of activation at the representation layer here, so these are fully connected weight matrices, by the way, in case you're wondering. I didn't draw all the connections in there, but they're fully connected. They gradually evolve over time as the system learns. And we can actually look at them as histograms of the activations of the units at different points in learning. So an epoch is a sweep through all the examples, one set of interleaved experiences, basically. And that's how we train neural networks, right? We use interleaved learning all the time. Anyway, so early on, the network hasn't really learned anything. The initial representations, even after 50 epochs, are basically based on the initial random weights that were in the network, and so they don't actually capture the structure there. But if you look at 150 epochs, you can see that, in fact, these patterns have differentiated quite a lot, so that now the two fish are quite different from the two birds, and vice versa. And then these animals are all quite different from the plants. There's been less differentiation among the plants, but still the trees are more similar to each other than they are to the flowers, and vice versa, right? So, and then if you look in the middle, well, we can use hierarchical clustering analysis to look at this again. And what we see is that early on, there's really no differentiation, and things aren't grouped appropriately anyway, just due to the random weights. At an intermediate point, the network has separated the plants from the animals, but not further differentiated things. And later still, it's sort of more fully differentiated the entire structure of the domain. So this is a phenomenon I call progressive differentiation, and it results from interleaved learning. And it captures this aspect of development. Now, like I say, Tim and I wrote a whole book about this. I don't have time to say anything more about that book, but we captured a lot of aspects of child development, of their conceptual knowledge of living things and other kinds of things in that work. So I was quite convinced that it's reasonable, at least, to keep thinking about this sort of gradual cortical learning-like process as one that kind of characterizes that knowledge that's intact after we remove the hippocampal system. But what happens in this system if we try to learn something new? So in our 95 paper, I considered the case of a penguin. And so what did I do to explore this? Well, I simply used this network that had already been trained with these 8 items. So it already knew about the 2 birds and the 2 fish and the 2 trees and the 2 flowers. And I just added a new neuron for this new input unit. I tend to think of these as sparse orthogonal distributed patterns that are sufficiently orthogonal from each other, so we're not relying on any similarity structure, but one-hot input units captures that same idea, so that's somewhat simpler to implement, so that's what we've done. And then I trained the network with these 2 items. Penguin is the correct output specified for that is living thing, animal, bird. So penguins are technically birds. But for the other pattern it was trained with, penguin can grow, move, swim. Okay, so this was the entirety of the network's experience. 2 different patterns, one penguin with ISA and one penguin with can. And I just tried to teach it this. So what happened? Well, it learned this new information quite rapidly. So this is a measure of the absolute error averaged over the output units across the 2 items that it was trained with as a function of repetitions of those items. But the consequence of this was it interfered with all the existing memories of the other birds and the other fish. And actually, a previous demonstration, this is where the word catastrophic from the title comes from, a previous demonstration that neural networks would show catastrophic interference had previously been done by McClelland, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins, and Neil Cohen, a neuropsychologist, who showed that you tried to teach a network a set of associations, and then you try to teach it a different set of associations, you could actually completely wipe out its ability to answer the first set of associations before it would even start to learn the new one. So this finding helps us to understand why we have these complementary learning systems. We do need to learn new things quickly, but if we tried to learn them quickly in our neocortical neural networks, they might produce a lot of this interference. And the reason why interleaved learning is effective is because it lets the network sort of use the gradient of the entire set of alternatives in the whole set of the environment, essentially, to find a pathway through the space of adjustments of connection weights that eventually carves out a place for the new item. But this depends on interleaved learning. So we need these complementary systems to allow rapid learning of new stuff without catastrophic interference with what we already know. So that was the purpose of our 95 paper, was to argue that point. And we said, okay, look, here's this general idea. The neocortex consists of all these different kinds of information about things, and then the hippocampus can sort of see the states all throughout this and have projections from them that then allow rapid learning to occur within the hippocampus. And then once that's occurred, we can have replay events occur so that we can interleave exposure to this new item with ongoing experience with other things. And so I then did another experiment where I didn't actually implement the hippocampus. I just basically said, let's add these two new items to our training set and continue the interleaved learning, okay? As if there was a hippocampus that might be helping us with that, but I didn't implement it. So in this set of results here, the network is learning about the penguin interleaved with ongoing exposure to all the other things in the environment. And it actually needs many more repetitions of that penguin information to integrate it into this cortex-like network. But the advantage is that it produces hardly any interference at all with what was already known, okay? So you might say, gee, did it fully integrate this? And we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. But that's the basic idea. Okay. Initial storage in the hippocampus followed by repeated replay, interleaved with ongoing repetitions of other things, leads to the consolidation of new learning in the cortex, avoiding catastrophic interference. All right. However, I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to tell you about this part really briefly. Unfortunately, it's a beautiful story, and Richard Morris deserves a huge amount of credit, but because I want to tell you about the kind of the quantitative theory part, I'm just going to have to give this part somewhat short shrift. Apologies to Richard here, but Richard's contribution to this debate was to say, look, sometimes we can consolidate new things quickly. And I know your community here involves people from psychology, but also people who study learning in rodents, and this is my opportunity to celebrate this because this work was done in rodents, and in fact, McNaughton is, of course, a rodent researcher, and so this whole theoretical enterprise has been strongly built out of connecting from the human to the rodent-based literature on these things. What Richard did was, hopefully I can convey this rather briefly, he trained animals on a flavor-place association task. And so what happened was this. The animal was placed in a start box that could actually be placed on any one of the four walls of this arena. So this is the actual arena, and this is a sort of a schematic of it. So the start box could be on any of the four sides. And in that start box, he'd be given a tiny taste of a flavor, like which might be, let's say, strawberry, okay? And then the animal was let out into the arena, and he had to find the hole in the floor that had three bigger pellets of this strawberry flavored food. So the animals learned about this very gradually over many, many sessions. But then what Richard did was he closed to, so this was interleaved learning, right? All 6 of these trials occurred every day with these 6 flavor-place associations. And after it was learned, that he switched it around so that 4 of them stayed the same, but he replaced 2 of them with 2 other ones. And they were actually very close by to the previous locations, and I'm mentioning that purposefully here. But now let's say we have a hot dog and a beer-flavored food. I don't know if they had those pellets available, but that's what I found on the web. So, and they were close by to those previous locations. And I'm not going to go through the graphs, but what he found was that after just one trial with these 2 new associations, he could lesion the hippocampus 48 hours later and then wait for the animal to recover, and they would be able to perform just as well on that one trial learning of these new associations as they could even if there was no lesion. So not only did they learn in one trial, but if it depended on the hippocampus, it only depended on it briefly, because you could take the hippocampus out 48 hours later and they still knew the information. They couldn't learn new ones after that, whereas the ones that didn't have the lesions could, so the hippocampus had to be there for the initial learning, but not for very long. And subsequent research showed that, and I can't go into this either, but that a lot of gene induction occurred in the cortex even in the first 80 minutes after that exposure, if these new information was given in the familiar environment. But if he gave it in a novel environment that the animal had never had experience of before, there was basically no learning in the cortex. So these were 2 amazing science papers that showed all this. Again, I've given them very brief presentation here. And he actually held this up as a refutation of the complementary learning systems theory, because it seemed to indicate that, in fact, the cortex can learn new things rapidly. And we said it was a slow process. So I realized that I'd miscommunicated about my theory. And so I went back and I thought more about this, and I kind of engaged with Richard's ideas within the context of the example that we've already seen before. So the basic idea here is that we're interested in, what does it mean for something to be consistent with what we already know? So here, I'm thinking of, this new knowledge is quite consistent because it's like even places that we already know about, specifically in this very familiar environment. But in the context of our knowledge of living things, you could think of it as a new item that you could add into the neural network without disrupting the structure that it already has. And so the penguin isn't really like that, because it's not a bird and it's not a fish, really. It's sort of halfway in between. So in order to get it in there, you'd have to carve out a new category within those animals. But if you tried to learn about a new trout, which is just kind of like any other fish, or a new bird that's kind of like any other bird, that would be schema consistent. You just, in this diagram, you just add it in under bird or fish, right? And that would be that. So I explored this. Again, I want to cover this briefly, using the same approach as learning the penguin initially, only this time, in addition to replicating the penguin experiment, I had an experiment with a trout or with a cardinal. And so there were 3 separate experiments. I'm going to average over the trout and cardinal because they produced very similar results. But what did I find? Well, the first thing I found was that the initial learning, even focused learning, without any interleaving, was very rapid for the things that are consistent. Even though it's completely arbitrary in some sense, like this new input item is orthogonal to anything else you know, so you have to learn that it's a bird or that it's a fish, but it's easy to learn that because it drops right in, it fits into the structure, right? Whereas the penguin is much harder to learn, and the new thing doesn't produce much interference if it's fully consistent, whereas to get the penguin in there, we had to get that interference. If we interleave, so that's the basic results. Yeah, if we interleave, of course, we can avoid the interference with the penguin, but we don't even really need it very much with the things that are already consistent. A few repetitions would be enough, and there wouldn't be much interference. Okay, so this is the part that I'm going to just skip. 15 minutes, good. Okay, so I'm going to be able to tell you about the theoretical part in my remaining 15 minutes here. So there are three things I hope to be able to touch on briefly. Are all aspects of new learning integrated into cortex-like networks at the same time? Is it possible to avoid replaying everything one already knows when one wants to learn new things? So these are the two questions that I'm going to have time to touch on very briefly. I think these sort of launch the opportunity to do a lot of ongoing explorations. I probably won't be able to say much about those, but you'll kind of get these two ideas, and then maybe they'll inspire you to do something to follow up. So in order to make progress on this, we're going to have have an explicit mathematical theory, and this is where Surya Ganguli came in. He and a PhD student and I have a paper that's going to appear in PNAS soon, in which we lay out these first three elements here, and then the stuff I've done just extending that work that we started with Surya and Andrew is what happens when we learn this additional item. But the basic theory here was developed primarily by Surya and Andrew. And then we're going to maybe talk about the consequences of this. So first I have to characterize the structure in a data set to be learned. Then we have to think about a network that can learn that structure. Then we think about the dynamics of learning, and that's where we'll get to be able to answer these questions. So here's the data set. This is pretty much the same as before. We now have a sparrow and a hawk for reasons that'll become apparent later. But otherwise, they're the same items. And you can think of what you're looking at here as a item property table, where black means this item has that property and white means it doesn't. And so you can think of these as 4 properties that all animals share with each other, and these as 2 properties that birds have that fish don't, and these as 2 properties that fish have that birds don't. And these as 2 unique properties of the sparrow, like maybe it's small and meek, and these as 2 properties of the hawk, like it's big and fierce. And then these are unique identifying individualized features over here. And here are the plants over there on the other side with non-overlapping features. So this is just a data set, okay? Item property matrix. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a singular value decomposition of this. What does that mean? We're going to ask ourselves, what are the dimensions of this data? What are the, if I just knew one split, let's say, this is what singular value decomposition is actually going to tell us. If I could just split these two things on one dimension, how much could I account for a lot of the stuff that's in here? And the first dimension of the singular value decomposition, indeed, is something that says, in this case, is this an animal? And if it is an animal, and there are 4 animals, then it tells you that, oh, it's got these properties, it's likely to have these, and less likely to have these other ones. And you know, if you take the product of this classifying variable times the strength factor times the feature vector, that gives you this picture here, which is the content of the data set that's explained by this dimension, okay? So this singular value decomposition has 8 dimensions to it. 1 for the animals, 1 for the plants, 1 that differentiates the birds from the fish, 1 that differentiates the trees from the flowers, then 1 that differentiates the birds from each other, 1 that differentiates the fish from each other, 1 that differentiates the trees from each other, and 1 that differentiates the flowers from each other. Okay, so these are the dimensions of this data set. And what you saw before in the progressive differentiation simulation was that the neural network was picking up on these first 2 dimensions very early in learning, and then later on, it picked up on these next 2, and it was beginning to show weak sensitivity to these when the simulation stopped. Okay? But that's the structure in the data set. That's just about the data. Why does the neural network exhibit sensitivity to this structure? Okay, so this is where the work with Surya comes in. Together, we have analyzed, I should say, they have analyzed deep linear networks, so minimal 2 layers of weights from input to hidden, hidden to output. The first observation about this, which I'll make extremely briefly, is that once you have at least 2 layers of weights, the learning in any one set of weights depends on what's already known in the other set of weights. So this is the reason why knowledge is essentially gradually built up over developmental time. There's these mutual dependencies here. So you have to start learning in one set of weights before you can learn in the other. And of course, you're learning in both of them in parallel. So, it's kind of a bootstrapping kind of process. So we're going to look at this in a simplified version of the Rumelhart network, where instead of having these contexts here, we're just going to flatten the output across the whole thing. And we're going to ask for each item, what are its features? And this is our neural network. It's a linearized network with 2 fully connected layers of weights. Okay, so the dynamics of learning in this are as follows. You can see it here. The network essentially learns each dimension on its own time scale and follows this sort of sigmoid approach to asymptote so the ultimate strength of the dimension is just the singular strength of the dimension itself. So the strongest ones are higher on the curve for that reason. These are just the singular values that I'm plotting over the course of learning. But they kick in at times that depend on the strength of the dimension. And it depends on it in several ways. The time till takeoff, as well as the steepness of the acquisition, as well as the asymptotic level. They all depend on this single strength parameter. So this explains this progressive differentiation phenomenon and many other phenomena as well that Tim and I had covered in our book. So now we can get back to learning something new again. Now it's going to be a sparrowhawk. And I picked this because it's within the bird domain, but it's going to cross up features of the sparrow and the hawk. So instead of being small and meek or large and fierce, it's small and fierce. And it's got its own unique distinguishing feature here as well that's new. So we can now do a singular value decomposition of this complete data set. And what you should be able to see here is that this new item, this is sort of done from scratch, right, with the whole new data set with the 9th thing, becomes part of the category of animals and of birds rather than fish. And it also adds its own unique new dimension. It colors the animal plant dimension because it contributes to the overall statistics of animals, and it colors the bird fish dimension because it contributes to the overall statistics of birds, but it also requires a unique dimension to be able to differentiate it from the other things that are in the network. Now, the singular value decomposition would ordinarily rank this above these lowest 2 guys here, but for the sake of comparison, I've just artificially sorted it to the bottom of the list. You can see that its dimension strength is actually a little stronger than these guys over there. So this is just the SVD. So what's going to happen when we try to learn this with interleaved learning? Well, we're going to see something that looks like this, where very rapidly the network learns a lot about this sparrowhawk, but then it hits this plateau. And while it's in that plateau, there's interference with the birds. Not so much with the fish or the plants. So this is similar to what we saw before with the penguin, but I didn't analyze it in quite as much detail then. And if we look at the singular value decomposition, what we see is that right away, the network is learning to adjust the SVD so that the strongest dimension has been adapted to capture the new overall statistics, and the plant and the bird fish one also has been adapted to capture the new statistics. But this long plateau is essentially associated with a period of time when this new dimension hasn't been integrated into the system yet, because it actually still has to learn that at the same slow timescale as it would have had to learn it if it had been there from scratch. And it's got to have that interleaved learning with the other relevant stuff to learn this new dimension. Okay, so the point of this part of the talk is that we can learn some aspects of new things really fast, but not the really arbitrary new stuff, which is kind of like specifically conflicting with other things. And we can even integrate that stuff into the cortical network quickly. So back to Richard's experiment, he put those two new flavors right near those old holes in the environment. Basically, I'm thinking he's just mapping them onto old structure, and that's easy. It's just sort of, boom, mapping it into a learned space. But developing a new dimension in your space is harder. Okay. So now, in this next simulation, what I simply did was I froze the weights from the hidden layer to the output side, so that the only thing the network could do is adjust the weights coming from the sparrowhawk into the hidden layer for the sake of seeing what happens. I ran that till this point and then stopped it. I then continued it after that, but we're going to look at the results of analyzing it at that point there. And what you can see is that the network's outputs have, for all the existing things, are perfect like they were at the end of learning about them. And what it's learned about the sparrowhawk is to basically say, yeah, it's an animal, it's a bird, and I'm confused about within the birds what properties it actually has. It's sort of like the average of all the birds. That's what it can learn just by learning how to project itself into the existing structure. That's easy. So maybe our cortical systems can learn that kind of new structure fast. But they can't learn this other aspect as quickly. Okay, so the last point I want to make, and I realize I'm actually going to be able to make it, so that's good, is to talk about how we might be able to increase the efficiency of the interleaved learning process. And this is something that Bruce McNaughton, actually Bruce is responsible for all this work because he asked me about this similarity-weighted interleaved learning. And I started to think about all these issues again. But here's the idea. Since the interference here in this full interleaving was really only occurring with the birds anyway, maybe all we have to do is interleave the birds and not really worry about everything else. Well, it turns out if you don't interleave anything from the fish, it doesn't work so well, but a little bit of interleaving of the fish, you don't have to worry about the plants at all. So we get a savings here, get virtually the same results with 3/10 as much interleaving, because you're only interleaving the birds and a little bit of the fish and then none of the plants, okay? So per epoch, it looks exactly the same, but the amount of interleaving per epoch is much less. And if you compare this to a sort of a uniform interleaving condition, where I just interleaved everything with a probability of 0.3, you know, the whole thing gets extended and it takes longer to learn. And this is the total sum of squares error. You can see that it's stretched out. It's, you know, basically it gets to pretty much the same point after the same amount of total exposure with this full interleaving, but you're wasting all the presentation of the plants and stuff that you're doing there. Okay, so summary of that. By focusing interleavings on items similar to the new item, we can learn the new item with far less replay of older memories. Now, unfortunately, I have to say that this doesn't always work. We've tried this in sort of more big, large-scale deep learning architectures for various MNIST and various other tasks, and it doesn't, the similarity weighting doesn't necessarily produce a big benefit, so there's a lot more work to do there. But I know I should stop, so I'll just show you my last slide here to wrap up. So these were the questions I asked on an earlier slide. Are all aspects of new learning integrated into cortex-like networks at the same rate? And the answer is no, not in the networks we've studied. Some aspects can be integrated quickly, but some are integrated much more slowly than others. And this makes predictions for experiments. We could actually test this in variants of Richard's experiments or other paradigms. And then the other question, is it possible to avoid playing everything one already knows? Yes, at least in some circumstances, but further research is required to understand that better. Okay, thanks.
Paradigm, this new one, that involve learned features, where the features of the data aren't so explicit, but maybe are a representation of a latent feature space?
Well, so we've tried to do this a little bit by virtue of such things as the following. In an RNN that's doing language prediction, we hold out a few words from the training set when we train the RNN, and then we also train it with them included, and then we find words that are similar to a subset of words, and then those are the words that we hold out this set of words, and then we have these other ones that we know would have similar representations if everything was included all at once, right? And then we try to do the similarity-weighted interleaved learning on the this set of new words that you haven't seen before, with the ones that we know should have similar representations to it being the ones that we're interleaving, okay? And in that context, that did not work better overall than just random interleaving. So we're not entirely sure what's going on with that yet. And more work needs to be done. That's sort of my last point, basically. But yeah, in that case, you've got nothing but like the one hot for the word on the input and on the output of this RNN that's basically doing language prediction. So it's got that same one hot sort of like input, but the output's also one hot, just like which word is it that I think is going to occur here. And it didn't work in that context in the experiments we've tried so far.
Best guess of why?
So I think this is where I'm hoping neuroscience will actually come to our rescue, and we'll learn something about how we ought to be representing things in deep learning nowadays. But this is wildly speculative, okay? I'm thinking that the patterns that the artificial neural networks are using aren't sufficiently orthogonalized, so that there's just a lot of overlap across all the patterns. The hierarchical structure, I don't know much about what that structure looks like. So if the SVD were to have cross-cutting structure that picked up on features across all the items, then there wouldn't be anything you could totally focus on, because it would be overlapping with. So take a gender feature, for example, right? A gender feature is going to be showing up in everything. The plant's genders are not so important, but just for the sake of discussion, let's imagine that this crossed the whole space. Well, then if I trained on a new item that involve gender, there would tend to be some cross-cutting engagement with everything in the entire space, and so that would tend to reduce the extent to which the similarity weighting could be so focused. So we need to explore, more about the structure of the data set itself, right? What is the structure in those data sets? That's very hard in deep learning, so, these little toy data sets, we can specify exactly what it is. But that's part of the answer to that question. Yeah. There was another question.
It was captured actually in
Oh, okay.
discussion.
Yeah, in the back.
Yeah.
Randy, hi.
Yeah, so sometimes it strikes me that interleaved learning will be beneficial and the other times not necessary. Would you speculate on when that would be? I mean, we were talking about second language learning before, and so interleaving would lead to some suggestions about how one should go about structuring a second language learning program.
Yeah, so, lots of thoughts come up about that, right? So if you take somebody from a culture and you drop them in a brand new culture and you isolate them from any speakers of their pre-existing language, and you do this at an earlier enough age, they are going to suffer from, loss of that original language to a very extensive degree. Now, in fact, since very early on in a chapter in the PDP books, Jeff Hinton already pointed out that even if you do get a loss of the apparent ability to produce particular outputs for given inputs, there's actually usually some latent trace of that still in the network. So it can be recovered a little bit faster than you might think. And that's probably true in our models as well. We haven't really focused on that. But setting that point aside, the more immersion you have in the new culture, the more you're going to get that effect of rapidly learning this new stuff at whatever cost to what you previously knew. And so this really, some people's theories about second language learning is basically exactly this, that the difference between the kid and the grandma is that the kid is thrown into the culture, has to go to school every day, and is immersed in learning the new language, where grandma stays at home and only talks to mom and dad. And they go out and do the shopping, and so they get a little bit more exposure to English than the grandma, but not anywhere near as much as the kid. And the whole business about critical periods is all just about this interleaving. I think there's also an entrenchment effect. Once weights get really structured in certain ways, it's harder to adjust them in new directions, and that's, so there's so much more to learn about the details of all of that, though.
Well, I know some folks have to be getting off to class and such, so why don't we take the rest of the questions offline and take our speaker once again.
Thank you.